What's up, guys? Welcome back to another video. This is a reaction to Why Ireland is Divided. And as a Brit who obviously knows somewhat of the history between Britain causing the issues within Ireland for years, hundreds of years ago, that I done a reaction to that a few years ago, I think about a year and a half, 2 years ago. And then more recent history, the split between Northern Ireland and Ireland, which I think is related to hundreds of years back, between the Catholics and the Protestants and stuff like that. So I guess the British interference back then may have then affected the stuff in the more recent history, but then obviously the 70s and stuff, there was a lot of hostilities between Ireland and the UK, or mostly I would say it's England really who are really doing it. And yeah, I mean, just seeing that, I mean, I'm not someone who's very knowledgeable, but seeing sort of the stuff that I've seen in the past gives you a small understanding of, I guess, why the two countries, and again, when I say the countries, England and Ireland, really just seem to not get on. When I was younger, I used to always watch, when I was watching, I remember getting if you're from the UK or Ireland, match attacks. I think you'll know what they are. Just basically sports cards for the World Cup. And I remember seeing Ireland and England, and I would always just seeing the sort of the nations near England do well. And when I was younger, I always thought, yeah, I just like these countries near me. I like the Irish or whatever. And then when I grew older, I realized, oh, these countries don't like each other. The people from each country don't like each other. And then obviously you learn things when you grow up. I'm still not very knowledgeable on the whole situation, which is why I'm doing this reaction. But yeah, that's just sort of my brief statement on that. In terms of how I feel about the Irish, I actually find the Irish people some of the funniest in the world, and I just enjoy sort of their humour, the Irish humour. Obviously, their drinking cultures. It's just, I think the Irish culture is just funny. It's very funny, and the people just seem great. To be fair, I mean, I'm gonna say specific people, but you got Conor McGregor, who blew up because of his humour and how he was. How brash he was, how he just didn't give a damn. Obviously, that's not representative of Irish people, but that's just a small little snippet of, I guess, why people fell in love with him because of how he was and stuff. But yeah, let's check this video out and see why Ireland is divided, and I guess what happened to cause it, what happened during time where there was attacks within both countries and all this stuff happening, and see the history of it really. But yeah, let's check this out and learn about this.
It's January 31st, 1972. Rubble fills the streets in the city of Derry in Northern Ireland, also known as Londonderry to British officials and local Protestants. A conflict that is present in the very name of this place is now manifest in the streets. 13 are dead, 14 wounded. 24 hours before, British soldiers fired 108 rounds into a crowd of civil rights protesters. Northern Ireland is getting ready to tear itself apart.
What, live rounds into people? That sounds like some sort of stuff you'd hear happening in Iraq when people are protesting the government's there. They'd get live rounds shot into. Jesus Christ. Not that long ago either.
In 2 days, the British embassy in Dublin will be burned down. And this is when the British Prime Minister calls a meeting with the Lord Chancellor and the Lord Chief Justice, John Woodry. These are two of the most senior legal officials in the United Kingdom. Lord Woodry would be tasked with investigating what happened here. Why were shots fired? Who was at fault? We're looking at the notes from that meeting, uncovered by researchers in 1995. What we see here is that in this meeting, these men seemed concerned about something different than the death of 13 people. The Prime Minister is emphasizing to Lord Woodry that this investigation needs to happen fast, to wrap up this matter quickly. They brainstorm ways that would make access to the tribunal limited. The Prime Minister then wonders where the investigation tribunal should take place. They admit that the obvious place would be the government building right next to the scene of the massacre. But there's a problem with this location, says the Prime Minister. He tells Woodry that this is on, quote, the wrong side of the river, where people don't support the British government. They should instead hold the tribunal a little distance away. Woodry initially disagrees, saying that if it's not held in the city where the massacre happened, that it would make it hard for witnesses to give solid evidence. But justice wasn't the most important priority here. The Prime Minister then says it all when he reminds Widgery that they were in Northern Ireland fighting not only a military war, but a propaganda war.
Damn, there you go.
This memo tells the story of a cover-up, how the British Army killed 13 innocent civilians, and how the British government quickly made plans to make it go away. So, what is the story of this memo, the sham investigation it created, and what really happened on that day? That would come to be known as Bloody Sunday.
Okay. I've heard of Bloody Sunday. I don't fully know. Well, I say I don't fully know about it. I mean, I've obviously now seen like the sort of the details of what happened on that day, but I don't know how I've heard of Bloody Sunday if I didn't know what it meant or what it was. Unless maybe I did know what it was before and I just sort of wasn't something that I remembered or something, but I don't remember learning about it. So I could be wrong, I don't know.
Pausing the video for a quick message from our sponsor.
Secure that bag, baby. Get that shmoney. Because again, these videos always get demonetized, so I mean, this is how he makes his money at the end of the day, so I've got to respect it, but...
Let's get back into this important story about Bloody Sunday. The bloody events of that Sunday in 1972 were the result of a line that was drawn on this island decades earlier. England had ruled over Ireland for hundreds of years, but after a brutal war, Ireland would gain its independence in 1921. As the British were leaving, they carved out a corner of this island to remain as a part of the United Kingdom.
See, I always wondered how this really happened. Because you hear like people like from Northern Ireland, the accents, I mean, to me, they sound the same as the people from the Republic of Ireland or Ireland. Obviously, I think that's just my British ears hearing it. Obviously, they do have differing accents. But the fact that there was this split, I never fully understood. And I know I'm always bringing this back to football or soccer, but like the players, some of the players who choose to play for Northern Ireland or players that are from Northern Ireland but then choose to play for Ireland, I'm always wondering why, because obviously I guess they have... Do you have like dual nationality if you're born in Ireland, or I guess people born in Northern Ireland, because their bloodline will typically come from Ireland. That's just how it is. I mean, at the end of the day, they are the same people, right? So it's one of those things where I guess it's quite hard to really judge, but a lot of the time you'll have players playing for the opposite country, or not the opposite country, but just for Ireland if they were born in Northern Ireland, or the other way around. I don't know if that happens as much the other way around, but you see it a lot, one playing for the other. I know that's the weird way to judge it, but I always just sort of see it from that sort of view. But yeah, I mean, I never really knew how this was split, what caused it, so he's going through it now.
A corner of this island to remain as a part of the United Kingdom. They would call it Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland was mostly populated by descendants of British colonists sent to Ireland during those years. They were mostly Protestants on an island made up of Catholics, and they were known as Unionists because they wanted to stay in the United Kingdom. It was the presence of these Protestant Unionists that was the main reason why the United Kingdom wanted to keep this part of Ireland. But also within these borders of Northern Ireland was a large population of Irish Catholics, known as nationalists, because they wanted to unify the island, making the North a part of the Republic of Ireland. But that wasn't going to be easy, because in Northern Ireland they didn't have the power. The Unionists did. And for decades after the partition, Catholics in Northern Ireland were discriminated against by the Unionists, who controlled the government and most of the wealth in the North.
Oh, damn.
This meant denying them access to public housing and education, which largely barred them from well-paying jobs, which in turn prevented them from...
See, what I don't understand, if they want to split the country and make a new country, why don't they then give everyone the freedoms that you'd have to then hopefully create a country that's good for everyone? Why would you just sort of give the advantages to a certain group of people? I hate this sort of stuff, looking at history. That's always just such blatant things that you've done these things for years and years, and then you cause all this hostility and hatred towards each other because you've not treated other people the same as other people. Like, I just don't know why. And in this case, I guess the Protestants and the Catholics. Like, it's just like, why would you do this? I don't understand the reasoning behind just not giving everyone the same sort of chances and all this sort of stuff, not giving everyone the same rights, etc.
Purchasing property And at the time, if you didn't own property, you couldn't vote. So by the late
Jesus.
1960s, people in Northern Ireland were fed
You couldn't vote if you didn't own a property. That sounds like a very dystopian world.
up with this situation. They start marching for their civil rights. These marches are often violently cracked down on by unionists, and many times the local police force would join in the violence to support the unionists. By the late 1960s, the local government comes out and bans these civil rights marches altogether. But banning the marches does nothing to de-escalate the situation. Civilians on both sides have already begun organizing into paramilitary groups, staging attacks across Northern Ireland. On the pro-Irish side is a group of nationalist fighters called the Provisional Irish Republican Army, or the IRA. They arm themselves and start using violence to achieve their goal of ending British rule in Northern Ireland. On the other side is the Ulster Volunteer Force, who say that they exist to fight back against the IRA and Irish nationalism. Violence spread.
Okay, it's easy to see how this would then lead to, well, I guess what was happening in the 70s and then the 80s, right? You've got both sides setting up, I guess, armies in a sense, to try and fight for their freedom, and the other one to sort of defend what they've got in a sense, or to defend what they're of holding from the other.
Car bombings in city centers, attacks on police, kidnapping.
Crazy to think car bombings in Ireland in the 60s and 70s. I can't comprehend that. I just don't, like, that's wild. That's 60 years ago, 50 years ago, maybe even like 40 years ago, really, because it carried on for a long time. Like, that's insane to me.
They all become common. But to many, this conflict, known as the Troubles, really begins in the summer of 1969. Despite the rise of violent groups, most Catholics in Northern Ireland just want basic civil rights, but they're now banned from marching.
I can see why.
And yet, in the summer of 1969, in the majority Catholic town of
if you're not allowed to have basic rights, what? I don't get it. That's so, like, the people in charge, what is their what is their reasoning for not doing these basic things?
Londonderry, the Unionist government lets a group of young Protestant boys march in a parade that passes right next to an Irish Catholic neighborhood called the Bogside. It was a provocative move, and it sparked a riot that escalated into a full-blown battle. Catholic residents had turned the Bogside neighborhood into their base of resistance, piling up bricks, wooden planks, and vehicles to erect barriers around their neighborhood. These barriers effectively sealed off the area from the rest of the city, preventing police and security forces from entering. In this act of defiance, they declared their territory Free Derry, symbolizing a self-government zone in the midst of this escalating tension. It was from this barricaded Bogside neighborhood that they fought police and Unionist marchers with marbles shot from slingshots, rocks, and Molotov cocktails. Police then escalated, marching into the Bogside, deploying gas and beating rioters. It was clear that the conflict had reached a whole new level, and the British government back in London had to do something about it. But instead of acquiesce to protesters, they doubled down. They aren't going to give up a part of their sovereign territory to nationalists and the violent IRA, who they view as rebels and terrorists. Instead, they respond with their army. This included the 1st Battalion Parachute Regiment, otherwise known as the Paras, an elite group of soldiers formed in World War II and trained for high-intensity combat. The Parachute Regiment had fought in active conflicts in the Suez Canal and Cyprus, and yet, somehow, here they were, arriving to Belfast to take on oppressed civil rights protesters.
You have to ask the question, why use paratroopers to act as policemen? The last thing you use is killers. Paratroopers are trained to kill.
The army presence in Northern Ireland doesn't achieve its mission of restoring order on the streets. The conflict just continues. Protests, crackdowns, attacks, bombings. By the summer of 1971, the Unionist government introduces a new policy that allows security forces to break into the homes of anyone suspected of being involved with the IRA and to arrest them without any evidence or trial. The British Army, including the Paras, conduct a 3-day violent raid in a Catholic neighborhood in Belfast, arbitrarily rounding up men and boys, arresting hundreds and killing 11 people, including a priest and a mother of 8 in Belfast alone. As mass arrests continue, civil rights activists plan another march against the brutal internment policy. They would hold the protest in the city of Derry, home to the Bogside neighborhood. Tensions in the city were at an all-time high, as 3 days earlier the IRA had violently killed 2 policemen here. Before the march begins, the army sends the paras in. The battalion that had just killed 11 innocent civilians was now preparing for this march. By 2:50 p.m. that day, witnesses report that 10,000 or more marchers had assembled. Their goal is to march through town and end up in the town center, where they will hold a rally. As the marchers move through the Bogside, they encounter a barricade that the army constructed to keep the protesters out of the city center, to contain them in the Bogside. March leaders instruct the people to take another route. They're trying to avoid a conflict. At the same time, a number of young men break off from the march and start fighting with the soldiers at the barricade. Soldiers begin shooting rubber bullets at the crowd, launching gas canisters, and firing a water cannon. Panic breaks out. By 3:55, the riot is mostly broken up as the march continues on their new path, but they would soon run into another barricade.
What?
Thousands of people trapped on this street. At 4:05, the paras are ordered to move in behind the marchers and start arresting anyone
Oh, what? So they've just trapped them? What?
associated with the rioting. With armored vehicles, they speed dangerously into this crowd.
So to start with, it was like it was a march, right? They're trying to get to the center, and then it's got a bit more hostile as they've been basically not allowed to get to the area that they're trying to get to. Try and find another route, and then they just trapped them. Flipping hell.
Start beating demonstrators, making mass arrests.
Get them cameras away!
People are fleeing and panicking, and then, 5 minutes after the start of the arrests, the first shots ring out. Gunfire will continue for the next 30 minutes. The crowd flees the violence, the gas, the gunfire, trying to get out to safety. But they're boxed in. The soldiers chase them into surrounding neighborhoods, firing, reloading, and continuing this relentless assault. The soldiers shoot several people from, quote, almost point-blank range, despite them posing no danger to the soldiers. Eyewitnesses report seeing soldiers shoot people who were already down and wounded, or shooting at a crowd of people gathered around a body, trying to give it first aid.
Oh my.
Local teacher who was at the march later reported that the army fired indiscriminately into a fleeing crowd of innocent people.
Fucking hell.
21 soldiers from the parachute battalion fired 108 rounds that day. And by 4:40 p.m., when the shooting finally stops, 13 people are dead and 14 are wounded.
Jesus Christ.
My young brother Michael Kelly was one who was murdered that day, just 17 years old.
Oh, these are. Oh my God. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Can't see.
And
that
it was
number. Is that 6 people? I mean, obviously all loss of life is horrible, but there's 6 people under the age of 18.
young brother Michael Kelly was one who was murdered that day, just 17 years old. And it was one of 6 17-year-olds who were murdered on Bloody Sunday.
Previous raids and killing by the army had been swept under the rug, but this case was different. Anger exploded all across Ireland. There were protests in front of the British embassy in Dublin.
What I don't understand is doing this sort of stuff and then the stuff previously, obviously oppressing and these horrible sort of bits of treatment. What did England at this point suspect would be the outcome? Did they think this is the outcome that then will lead to peace and happiness? Like, is this just like, are these people like really like doing this stuff, planning it and thinking it's gonna work out? What? That's just insanity to me. This is wild. This is the sort of stuff you wouldn't associate to happen in this part of the world, let alone in Ireland, where they're basically just being killed in broad daylight by the police. Or I say the police, they're supposed to be the police. They're obviously not the police. They're some of the, I guess, best trained troops at, well, I guess, being put in situations in war where they're in life or death situations, Were they told to open live rounds? I don't understand how this has even happened.
And 2 days later, it was burned to the ground. This couldn't be ignored. And that gets us back to this memo, the meeting between the Prime Minister, the Lord Chancellor, and the man who they chose to lead the investigation, Lord Widgery. In this meeting, they decide that the investigation is not an investigation at all. In fact, Lord Widgery's job would be to produce a document that protects the soldiers and the government from scrutiny. And these notes show us that the Prime Minister was far more worried about the optics, the location of the trial, the speed, Widgery adding that it would help if the inquiry could be restricted in scope. He only wants to cover the events of that day. He doesn't want to look at the motivations of the soldiers, the army leadership, the context that could have led to this. He didn't want to ask why trained killers were the ones brought in to peacekeep a protest about internment. And that's because, as the Prime Minister would remind Widgery, they were fighting a propaganda war here, meant to keep the reputation of the UK positive, while maintaining the oppressive status quo in Northern Ireland. So with that, Lord Widgery takes the guidance from his Prime Minister and starts his investigation. As discussed, the investigation isn't based in Derry, but instead in a nearby Unionist majority town. The investigation is completed in just 3 months, and on April 18, 1972, Widgery delivers this report, stating that the soldiers who shot at the protesters were actually not to blame. In fact, anyone who listened to the soldiers give their testimony, quote, could not fail to be impressed by their demeanor. In fact, he finds that the soldiers were quite disciplined on the day of Bloody Sunday. They were just following orders. Widgery then accounts for all of the shots fired, 108 in total. The soldiers are kept anonymous, just given letters instead of names. And you can see that soldiers like Private H shot so many rounds that he would have had to reload. Then Widgery issues his conclusion. And when it comes to blame, Widgery is clear. He says that, quote, there would have been no deaths in Londonderry if those who organized the illegal march had not thereby created a highly dangerous situation. It was inevitable, and it was the protesters' fault. He mostly ignored the hundreds of eyewitness accounts from that day, saying that they came to him too late in the process. These statements would later be stuffed in a box and unseen by the public for decades. In fact, Widgery never even heard from the wounded victims because they were still in the hospital, and he, quote, did not think it necessary to travel all the way there to get statements from them.
This is actually just pissing me off. Like, it's just really frustrating me how obviously how biased this basically is. They're just fabricating everything, really. Making it just, again, like he said many times, trying to make them be seen in the best light possible, instead of actually owning up to what's really happened, which is just so, I can't put into words how much it just annoys me. It pisses me off because this stuff just shouldn't have happened in the first place. This is obviously one situation where this has like happened, but I'm assuming throughout this whole like 20-30 year period where there was wars or whatever was happening between, again, I'm going to say England. I know is it the UK or Great Britain, however you want to say it. I'm going to say England because it is pretty much England doing this versus Ireland. There's multiple things that would have happened, right? But Jesus, man, I didn't even know of this, to be honest. I'd never heard of this ever, and now hearing of it and what truly happened and how it all led to like 13 lives being lost, it's just a bit ridiculous, to say the least.
He concludes that the soldiers fired in self-defense and that they were fired on first.
But Widgery was put in place to do a job, and that job was to protect parachute regiment killers. They set out to protect the perpetrators and vindicate them and lay the blame on our people, and that's exactly what Widgery did.
Widgery himself was a soldier here, fighting a propaganda war for his prime minister, and he produced exactly what was expected of him, a document that protected the soldiers, the army, and the men that unleashed them on a civilian population. In following years, no soldier would be prosecuted for the 13 deaths. Bloody Sunday and the subsequent cover-up escalated the conflict in Northern Ireland in ways that no event had.
Both sides seem to have come to the conclusion that there are no moderate solutions left.
Everyone in the area is automatically a suspect. The innocent often suffer.
IRA recruitment boomed after the massacre. Bombings and attacks continued across the region between paramilitaries on both sides. The army continued to crack down. Mass arrests and hunger strikes became common news.
Hunger
And for
strikes.
20 years, the hope of some kind of justice for Bloody Sunday looked dimmer and dimmer. Even still, Irish Catholics in the North started marching every year to remember their dead. The massacre had become a symbol to nationalist communities of how the British government would treat them. For most, it was a confirmation of what they had already known. By the 1990s, the conflict had settled into an uncomfortable stalemate that drove both sides to the negotiating table. Those who had been traumatized by Bloody Sunday and the subsequent cover-up fought to include a real investigation as part of the peace process. One of these activists was John Kelly, who we talked to for this story.
So in other words, people were putting it forward all the time. You can't move forward unless you sort Bloody Sunday out. And there's only one way to sort it out, is to set up a new inquiry, you know.
And it worked. In 1998, the Good Friday Agreement was signed.
So that's what I've heard it from them, the Good Friday Agreement. I think this is where I've heard the term Good Friday or Bloody. I think I'm getting it confused, to be fair. Good Friday and Bloody Friday are two very different things.
It's a peace deal between the sides. And as a part of the agreement, the British government...
Bloody Friday, Bloody Sunday. Okay, I'm getting confused. Bloody Sunday and Good Friday. I think I'm getting them both confused. That's probably what I was thinking of.
Government would conduct a real investigation as to what happened that day. Over the course of 12 years, the British government would spend £200 million to right their wrong. And the resulting report would go on to tell a very different story than the report Widgery had produced. It acknowledges that the IRA was there that day and had fired on soldiers, but that none of this firing provided any justification for the shooting of civilian casualties. It says that none of the soldiers fired because they were attacked with bombs, as the soldiers previously testified. The report says that the soldiers lied to investigators to justify firing so many shots that day. And most importantly, it concludes that, quote, none of those who were murdered that day was posing a threat of causing death or serious injury. In the end, this reckless use of deadly force strengthened the IRA and made this violent conflict in Northern Ireland worse.
What happened on Bloody Sunday was both unjustified and unjustifiable.
After decades, an old wound was tended to. A formal apology, an admission of guilt, and an exoneration of previously blamed victims. The conflict in Northern Ireland, or the Troubles, killed over 3,500 people and inflicted extreme injustice on hundreds of thousands more. The proper investigation into Bloody Sunday provided a measure of justice to these victims. But for some, the report falls short of true accountability. The trauma from protracted conflicts leaves deep marks, and many today still live with the memory of the injustices and discrimination that would never have its day in court. Injustice from that one Bloody Sunday, but also from those many troubled years.
Flipping hell, man. God damn. The world is a dark place. I mean, I say that. I mean, this is just insane. I mean, when you see this stuff and then they finally admit that they were in the wrong and they apologize after all these years. I mean, it's good you done it then, but you could have done it way before and you could have not done it in the first place. But hey ho, the world has some horrifying stories like this that you just can't really fully understand, right? As an Irish person living on the border, I've been waiting for this video for some time now. The sad reality is the tension still exists in some parts all these years later. A part 2 covering the events that later followed Bloody Sunday needed. I mean, this video here says I've watched it. I watched the first minute. I've not watched it through all this way long. But I think this describes it a lot more. So I might do a reaction to this next if people would want that. Never thought I'd see Johnny make a video on my country. As someone who lives in Northern Ireland, I never expected this video. It's a long time Irish subscriber. I never clicked onto one of your videos fast enough. A brilliant watch. Hopefully the fact that you've uploaded this sheds light to an audience that may not have heard of thus horrific event that happened on this island. It's horrible, man. It's just horrible to see this stuff, honestly. To learn about the horrible things that happened because of your country in a country pretty close by. It's just it's pretty horrible, and it's just depressing to see that this really happened, and frustrating to see how it was allowed to happen in the first place and all that. But I guess let me know your thoughts on this. Again, this was my first time really understanding this and learning about this specific day. Obviously, there's a lot more to this because a lot of stuff preceded this, right? But yeah, if you want me to react to this, let me know. I'll do that. But yeah, until next time, peace.